This is okay. It's probably, I think, the second last project or session of the whole conference. So thanks for everybody hanging in there. I know it's been an effort to be running this conference on top of everybody's working lives. But I think we've been having some really great discussions. So thanks a lot for turning up. And let me just start by acknowledging that I am here on the unceded territories of the Darug people on the banks of the Georges River, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for the care of this country. And I join with them now to look after it. And unfortunately, I didn't get to do my beautiful walk along the river this morning to say hi, but it's also pouring with rain. So anyway, I guess what I might do is share my screen, because I've got a few slides that really introduce. Now it should go to, yeah, should go to the whole thing. Yeah, I mean, thanks again for your, interest in returning to this proposal. I thought it was a good idea now, 6 years on, to come and revisit it, because so much has happened, and it was all, I think it's an interesting thing we were trying to do, and I'd like some discussion about what we think of it now and what's happened since. So I guess for those refreshing the memory, those who were involved, we've got the list here of all the people that were actually involved in the proposal that we wrote, which was a research proposal submitted to the Transformations to Sustainability program of the International Social Science Council. It was a pretty ambitious kind of thing to do at that stage of our formation. It was before the formation of the CEI. So it was really a group drawn from the CERN network with many people from the Community Economies Collective. But as you can see, people like Mitch Rose and Shemsa actually aren't members of the CERN network, but were close friends or, colleagues. And I've just italicized Wendy, Isaac and Jaron, because they were involved in the discussion on Monday of the proposal. So great, thanks Isaac for coming again today. And I'm just putting down on the right-hand side the countries that the proposal intended to do research in, and we all had connections to research going on in those countries, which entered into the first seed grant. So just a bit of background on what it was. This Transformations to Sustainability program was introduced by the International Social Science Council as in 2014 as a new initiative to try and empower, as it says, social sciences to take the lead in, I've got myself, I can't see these things because my pictures are on, take the lead in north-south interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research addressing the challenges of global environmental change and sustainability. So we were very excited by the idea that there was an International Social Science Council. I think we even knew it existed, and that they were going to start this new program. And they had funding from all sorts of authorities, from national authorities in Sweden, but also philanthropic funds and so on. In the intervening years, actually, the International Social Science Council has joined together with the International Science Council or the physical scientists, and it's now just the ISC, not the ISSC. So what they offered in phase one was to fund seed grants. We were successful in getting a seed grant of about 30,000 euros to look at rebuilding livelihoods to meet the challenges of climate change in post-crisis communities. That was what we put in for. And the idea was to get a seed grant to start formulating a much larger project that would last over 5 years, that would be a transformative knowledge network. So we were successful in getting this first seed grant, and then we spent quite a lot of time formulating a proposal that we submitted in 2016, and we devised a proposal called to form an international network for ethical economic prototyping. And we were unsuccessful in that round. I think there were 3 projects were funded. Most of them they all went to very established groups like the Sussex sort of international science policy group, where Andy Sterling is. I think Ashish Kathari might have got one that might have been the beginnings of what the global tapestry of alternatives is now. Now I'm kind of reading into the backstory there. I think that's what might have happened. And there was another one. I can't remember that. There has been a second phase of these, of this whole project. And this is now the second phase run by the International Science Council and drawing on the same kind of funding agencies from Sweden and this Belmont Forum and Norface. I don't know where that one's from. And now they're funding 12 research projects that are running from 2018 to 2022. And I think at some point it would be very interesting for us to perhaps commission somebody to actually analyse these 12 projects and see what they're actually doing. For instance, that GOST one on the left, the Governance of Socio-Technical Transformations, is one that Andy Sterling and Sheila Jasanoff are running, and it's very much an STS kind of project. But there's a lot of others that are, things about water. I mean, there's a whole range of things, but it would be kind of interesting to do an analysis of the kind of projects that got up compared to what perhaps we might like to do in the future or we're proposing to do. So just to refresh your memory of what we proposed to do, we wanted to try and, I guess, step back from all the, involvements, examples of community-based research, action research that we were doing, and other interventions that weren't just community-based, to try and understand how ethical economic practices were being enacted and produce these audit tools that could kind of capture what were these decision frames, how were ethical practices being kind of negotiated, and try and then extract from that an idea of ethical economic prototypes that would crystallize those experiences and could be something that we could put out there, that would travel, that would start to put community economies thinking into a framing that could become a new kind of a common sense, I suppose. And then we wanted to try and test out the transformative potential of those prototypes in real life situations, like actually initiate some more action research around those proposals or around those ethical prototypes, and then create an acceleration hub, which would be like a big library of prototypes where people could download information, but also upload stories of what they've done. So rather than it be a website that was just pushing stuff out, it was going to be a site that people could start to put stuff into. So we had this very cute kind of audit, amplify, associate, accelerate kind of framework. So I guess what I was thinking we could discuss was now some reflections on that proposal, but perhaps before we do that, I think just to think about what we and the CERN members have been up to in the last 6 years and to what extent it bears upon the proposal before we get onto whether it was robust or not. I mean, obviously our thinking has moved on somewhat. And I guess the ultimate question is there something that could come out of this that might feed into a future proposal at an international scale? I mean, I think we've been quite successful at getting national level grants, and members of us have. How would we go for something a bit bigger like this? And I guess to start with, let me just reflect a little bit on a few of the things that have happened in the last 6 years. I just, for another purpose, was looking at one of the reviews of the Handbook of Diversity. I mean, obviously the Handbook is one of the things that's occurred in the last 6 years, which is a major achievement, I think, and has established us as a field of study. And we had suggested in the proposal that we would put forward a handbook of ethical economic prototypes, but in a way that perhaps was premature, because I think that probably needed to be preceded by this handbook, which is just laying out the diverse economies framing and showing the wealth of activities and practices and theorizations that are there. But when I looked at one of the reviews of this book in Housing Society and Theory in Society, this person is arguing that housing theorists could really learn a lot from diverse economies. But what they did is produce this little graph of the citations of diverse economies work. I've never seen this before. And you look at when we put that proposal in, was 2015. And you can see there was a significant jump between 2014 and 15 of the citations of diverse economies work. And now, it's been a kind of I get a bit more of a plateau, and how accurate this is, I have no idea. But it just shows that we perhaps put this proposal in at a time that was a little bit before our time, and now we're at a different stage in terms of visibility in a range of different contexts. So that's, I guess, one thing that's happened. The other thing is, and this is just a very initial attempt that Stephen and I and Prior have started to do, and now Inca is involved with, where we started to map out all the different organisations, community initiatives, research initiatives that community economies thinking and us as scholars and practitioners have got something to do with, sometimes very directly in terms of informing practice. For instance, I just found out earlier in the conference from Anup from India that Ambedkar University's development program has students working in 100 villages in India, basically using the community economies kind of methodology. Now, I'd never known that before. I knew that Bhavya was doing that and had done that for 6-7 years in one part of India, but I had no idea that our work, and also the work of Anup and Cullenberg and others, was informing this kind of thing. So this is a very incomplete map, but one of the things we're trying to do is, which I think we hadn't done at the point where we tried to put this proposal in. We really had we all knew who we worked with, but we didn't really have a sense of the wide scan of projects that might have been influenced to some extent by our kind of work. So there's other things that we could all mention, I think, in terms of what has happened in those years, and it would be interesting to hear other people's reflections. Just to convey some of the things that came out of the discussion on Monday, Wendy said that the proposal really helped her crystallise what they proposed then to do in the WeGo project, the wellness, ecology, whatever it is, the big Marie Curie training program that she's coming to the end of, which took on 15 PhD students, and they've all been doing research in different ways, informed to some extent by community economies thinking, and they kind of decided not to do their own conference, but started to feed into the degrowth conferences that have been happening in Europe. And she had some interesting reflections on issues around that. But anyway, she said our proposal really helped her conceptualize this other big proposal that the EU won, which to some extent, I guess, we've had some relationship with. Jaren talked about the way in which, what she had recommended, that she and Yahya and Shemsha had actually proposed to do the work in Turkey, in the Kurdish regions, became impossible because of the state violence that then started to occur. And the very things that we were proposing to focus on, these ethical economic practices, were the very things that the state violence almost focused on and tried to smash. So it was, that was kind of very, well, obviously distressing, but she also said that she was able to use a lot of the thinking that went on in that proposal to inform the work that she's doing now, which is around care and elder care. And she's been using the Commoning Identity Kit and other things from that project. So she felt that thinking work really fed into what she's doing now in a really interesting way too. So just lastly, my reflections. And what I think one of the things that we proposed to do in that research was to devise so-called technologies that highlight ethical economic thinking in order to change economic thinking. And I think our work has developed even more. And perhaps I think we need to revalue what we've actually achieved in terms of the technologies we've actually developed. And even though ABCD is something we inherited or we drew in, we picked up from Kretzmann and McKnight, I think just as Katherine and I and Isaac are both involved in major kind of agricultural development kind of projects where we can see that asset-based stance, that approach that we tried to use and marrying it with diverse economy practices and community economy kind of commitments is still so under-recognised and under-operationalised in that context. And it's still a major eye-opener for people when we start to talk about it as a different kind of technology to start using, to start interventions, so on. Obviously, the iceberg image has really taken off in so many ways. I think that was obvious through the Redrawing Economy project and the way in which it's being used and taken up, and particularly informing a lot of work that artist activists are doing. Kevin's work that he displayed to us in the wonderful keynote, this whole idea of communities at sea, or the algorithms that he's been working with, are another, incredible kind of device that I think is something that's come out of his research. And I guess one of the things that really occurred to me was how the depth of commitment and allegiance to place is really informing our work now. Some of us have got 20 years of working with the same communities, or in some ways having that relationship with these projects over a very long period of time, which means that we can really reflect on things that have worked and not worked, or develop them like Kevin's been doing. The IDT is another kind of emerging technology that's really, I think, got a lot of potential. The CROI is something, the Community Economies Return on Investment, is also something that is, again, being operationalised and used in different ways. The Commons Identikit, again being used in lots of different contexts. And I think this surviving well balance between 24-hour work, the 24-hour clock, and the eco footprint. We had a discussion about this yesterday in the post-development section. And I just feel like there's a lot of potential here for this practice of communities actually mapping out their collective work patterns and their ecological footprint as a way of juxtaposing what they're doing across the world. And I was wondering whether we might even be thinking of a way of talking about that as a device for offsetting, because there was a way in which Kelly was talking about her students being very interested in what's happening in Fiji, and then the Fijian people who are all living a less than one planet footprint, all interested in becoming like New Zealanders. And how do we actually sort of intervene in that discussion? Like the whole, COP22 is 26 or whatever, is just looking at fossil fuels, but actually not looking at what our ecological footprint is. And we've got this very interesting technology that we haven't really been able to operationalize in some ways. And I guess that brings me to the question of what did we ever mean by prototypes, and to what extent the prototype language was the right one, and to what extent we could use it to think about things like community economy hubs, like the Centre for Plausible Economies, or the Mapo Community House, or even the Janbun Gardens, which is in the film tonight. But all the other kinds of prototypes that we were gesturing towards, the one that we really elaborated was something around community-supported fishing and care of the commons. And I'm really interested to hear from Kevin, because we know that kind of fell over to some extent in the last 6 years, at least in Port Clyde. So what do we actually mean by prototypes, and how might we use that terminology in future? And I'm going to stop sharing now, because they were the thoughts I had, and I think I'd just like to open it up, and maybe we all go in turn and have a bit of a reflection on what occurs to us looking back at this proposal. So who feels like going first? Looks like, Anne, you're about to unmute yourself. Is that right? Should we catch you before you paused it?
I'm happy to. I wasn't about to unmute. I was leaning forward to look at my screen, but I'm very happy to go. So I'm following your prompt question, round one. Is that correct? Just for guidance? Yep. So
yeah,
how robust was this proposal? What do we think of it now, 6 years on, and that particular question? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I guess my notes are, I think it's really coherent in terms of how robust the proposal is. It has clear phases and work packages, and I think it's robust in terms of addressing critical issues. So when I read it and I think about social transformation and economic change, and the phrase of how social transformation is informed by economic change, I think that still really stands as a critical set of issues and questions that are being raised. And I think the way in which it conceptualizes transformation to be facilitated through three potential means, language, subjectivity, and collective action, is also still very relevant and powerful. So, and I think the last thing I would say is creating an environment where labs in which we experiment and learn across difference and learn across place is also incredibly powerful. So I think for me, those things are the elements that I think still make it very robust. But in the other prompts, other rounds, I have other things to say about what's happened since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fine, great. So maybe anyone want to jump in? Or do you want to pass it on to someone? Stephen, how about you? You're next on. You're next, sitting next there.
Yeah, sure. Boy, there's a lot for me to gather, and like Anna, I'm doing it on very little sleep because of this pain that I have. So yeah, I think the proposal 6 years on still reads as really robust, and as you said in your presentation, there's been a lot of further developments and institutionalization of the community economies approach that I think would make for a more compelling track record. I noticed from the 10 groups that we located that Latin America was kind of left off, and that certainly it could be a much stronger presence now if we're thinking about the assets of the organization. I guess as I read through it, I felt like for some reason that language of ethical dilemmas and ethical flashpoints was, I was worried a little bit about the optics of it. And I was just thinking about some of the language that we've learned from working with our design colleagues, Cameron Tonkinwise and Abby Melek-Lopez, about this idea of using multi-level perspectives and problem setting as a sort of collaborative exercise in the first phase to really get at what are the issues, even calling them an ethical dilemma, perhaps sort of prescripts the conversation in a particular way. And then that ends up informing a process of transition design. So I guess the larger point I would make is that having worked with the two of them and with you, Kath, across a few projects, that I think there's probably a lot of concepts that we could borrow from design theory and practice to strengthen the terms of the proposals. Like, for instance, the role of speculation, which we used last night in our Redrawing the Economy project, and also that idea of design futuring that we've gotten from Tony Fry, that idea of moving backwards from a desired outcome and then thinking quite creatively about what it takes to get from one state to another state. So Abby, for instance, was talking last night about even moving beyond the language of problems and talking about sort of moving from a state A to a state B is a more accurate description of what transition involves. I think we could add to the list of projects that have kind of followed on afterwards that were sort of operationalizations of what ANEP was trying to do. So for instance, the Monsoon Asia project was one, I think, that came out after this. And there, the real device for thinking about different futures was to return to history and see, well, what practices were there historically in Southeast Asia that contributes to resilience, or in South Asia as well, and what could we learn? I think there was a great demonstration of that last week, Kath, when you presented with Anissa and Bhavia, specifically around food. So that seems to be an area of foci that might be worth exploring. And then I think also the Solidarity Economy project that I've been involved with Craig, Malia, and Mariana, we've also been using mapping, but mapping in a particular way, which is thinking about sort of the density or distribution of solidarity activities, their concentration in BIPOC communities, and how that's in part a function of a history of the state, and in particular the practices of redlining, right? So it wasn't just that cities are dense and that's where solidarity economy takes place. It took place in particular reasons because of history, right? And so that, I think, that has a bearing on how we think about transition. I feel like there's more that I had to say, but
Well, we can come, you can have another round, Stephen. So maybe
yeah. That's more than enough. Thanks.
Yeah, I think because Anne, you just limited yourself to the first question. We don't have to do whatever. I think we've got plenty of time to kind of have another round. So, Kevin, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I'll just try to say one thing. I'm not sure what response I'm responding to.
Doesn't really matter in a way, just anything.
Yeah. I guess I wrote down a bunch of things, but the thing I want to start with is my experience over the last couple of years has been applying to, National Science Foundation for like what I might call a sort of standard academic proposal and grant, which is like classic, producing knowledge. And then there's these other kind of things that I've also applied for, which are like also NSF, but much more sort of neoliberal initiatives and whatever that are about producing things, products, they refer to products and these kind of products that come out of your project and so on. And it dawned on me like, oh, well, actually what the ISSC was asking was kind of a product-y thing and not a knowledge production thing. And what I've learned is like, that's a whole other mode of proposal writing and strategizing and what it is you're promising and not promising. Like it's totally different, right? Like it has similarities, right? Of course, it has to have the academic concepts built in and all that kind of stuff. But it's, just a few examples, like the things that I've proposed and was successful getting, are like this big team things, and you've got to have a whole range of players that are members of the team, but you also have to have like, an advisory board that suggests who would be the user of this, and then you've got to have like plans for, not to be neoliberal and crass, but like who's going to invest in it and why? And how will the product be maintained over time? Like it's like they're making you think of all these things that you don't think about when you're like, I'm going to write a handbook or I'm going to like produce my knowledge into a website. It's like, okay, that's not the product. Like the product is this kind of thing that people are interested in and they know why they're interested in it and they're going to invest in it in one way or another and it's going to be maintained over time and it's going to grow. And like that could be the state investing in it, or it could be a corporation investing in it, or it could be a bunch of NGOs investing in it. But like, who is going to invest in it and why is like a big part of these projects that I've been involved in more recently. And then like, yeah, and like that, and that sort of like level of another, I don't know how to describe it either, but like making sure there's people on your team who are professional enough that the product will be slick enough that people will even invest in it. Like there's this whole kind of, I mean, it's not a logic I like at all, but that's once you shift from this kind of traditional mode of us getting money to do the things we want to do as academics to this other mode of like, I'm going to produce products that people are going to want and it's going to change the world. Like that goes in a whole other, yeah. So that's.
So what is a product for you?
Well, in our case, like right now, I'm working on a product with a whole big team of people that's designed to take climate change projections of the marine environment and make them available to decision makers, around wind energy and fisheries and whatever other stakeholders might have an interest in knowing the future of the ocean, and of course, I'm also trying to integrate into that a priority for communities and community development vis-a-vis knowledge of the future of the ocean and blah, right? So like it becomes but the product is like a whole set of software and web-based tools that integrate these projections of the ocean, that have these dashboards that let communities look at the data in certain ways and rescale it to their needs and like, all that kind of stuff. So we have like a graphic designer and we've got like representatives from wind energy and representatives from fishing communities, and they're all on the board of advisors, and they're all like, you know, like what the NSF wants us to say, wants us to tell the NSF that we know what their needs are and we're meeting them with this product. Like, I know that's like totally neoliberal and really capitalist sounding.
But do you think, I mean, do you think the prototype we were talking about was really a product? It should have really been a product. Or
well, a little bit. So I know that's an extreme, you know, I just kind of painted an extreme, but there's something in the middle that says like to propose a prototype and then to say there'll be a website that anyone can come to and use. It's like, well, you've got to really, you got to like know who's going to come to use it and why and what they're looking for. How are they going to, again, invest in it, either with their time or with their resources or with whatever, and how will they want to use it and see it maintained over time? Like that's kind of the take home from, I guess.
So, I mean, are any of your devices or products what you would consider ethical economic prototypes?
No.
Well,
they're sites of struggle around ethics of economic development, let's put it that way, and I'm using them as sites of struggle, and hoping they can work as such over time. But to say that they're designed to foreground a particular ethics, yeah, and it's an ethics of marine spatial planning, stakeholder development, and so on. You know, it is a liberal democratic ethic of of a
and
kind of, you know, transparent.
That's what we wanted to try and challenge. We wanted to try and have something that had a different ethic. So, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of making this into a dialogue, but maybe, do you want to say more at the moment, or should we get more people's responses at this point?
I've got a whole list of things, but just one last quick word is just the very idea of the ethical. You know, it was interesting reading, like, I just was like, kind of, what do we mean by it? Like, I know we know what we mean by it, but like the reader is like, ethical economic prototypes and ethical, like it just becomes an adjective that means like the good one. And I don't know what that reads like to a range of readers who are not us, you know, like, and I thought like, well, couldn't we just talk about economic practices? And I was like, how about, God forbid, sustainable economic prototypes, you know, as opposed to ethical, like, and that would resonate across a whole range of funding agencies in ways that ethical doesn't.
I think that's a big issue for us. It's like, you know, how much do we talk to ourselves versus talk beyond ourselves and have that sense of what's communicable or not communicable? Yes, okay, there's some great comments too, but maybe just more reflections at this point. So Jen, do you want to go next?
Hi, thanks, Kath. And it's great to see everybody too. Really nice to be with everybody. So I suppose one thing that really stood out for me is, and I think you touched on this, Kath, just how much work we've all done, both in leading up to that application and also in the 6 years or so since then. And, you know, I sort of wonder to what extent we're such an untapped resource ourselves. And, you know, I almost feel like we could do some of this project ourselves through the CEI symposia, for example, and getting to know a little bit more and talking more about each other's various projects. So I, you know, and I sort of think about, you know, you put up, Kath, about Kretzmann and McKnight and ABCD, and how, you know, to some extent they've been saying the same thing for decades. And, you know, and I know it's important to, you know, keep up with new things, but I just feel like we haven't necessarily exploited everything we've done, and that it's such a resource for each other. so I can imagine a series of CEI symposia that where we actually started doing some of the things that we were suggesting in the project. And so there's that, and I just picking up on Kevin and the product thing, in a way it also makes me think about what we're trying to do with fundraising for the CEI. And in a way, CEI/community economies is a sort of product that we're trying to get funded at the moment. And so I think some of those things that you've raised about how to think about that, Kevin, are probably really useful. And again, it's not that we need to do more research. We've got the stuff already. It's how do we frame what we've done in a way that both uses our language and draws on other languages, but sort of lightly, so we don't lose, what is, the heart of what it is that we're really interested in. So that's probably all I want to say at the moment.
I mean, you mentioned in the chat all the work that Katherine and
the Melanesia project,
which is a whole other kind of, and we did produce a product to some extent.
It
hasn't been used. So and we've never done the work of trying to figure out what you're talking about, Kevin, which is how do you actually find a market for that product? Because I think there would be some. So I totally agree with you. I feel like there's a wealth of stuff we've done, and we've not even have an inventory of our own whatever stuff and devices. We keep producing more. Anyway. So who'd like to go next? Isaac, did you want to make another comment? I mean, you also talked on Monday, but if you wanted to come in.
Just very briefly. So one of the things I spoke about on Monday was, I think, the Monsoon Asia project and the keywords research for me did move things along in terms of the negotiations that underpin practices. What's at the heart of this prototyping application was not the initiatives as such, but the negotiations that underpin the processes, practices around which these initiatives emerge. And that's what we're looking to see, is if it can be transferred from one context to another and how those negotiations carry. So I think that the Keywords project advanced that a lot, as Stephen said, by looking at history, but making that a lot richer. I don't have
just on that, Isaac. Just on that, yesterday, the talk was given by Kelly's colleague from Fiji, was just amazing. I mean, it was practices that are being worked on now, and he did the language of each of them, and they were all kind of what we would have seen as community economy practices that are still vital in the villages that he's working on. So that Keywords project, obviously could spread all over the world but whether it's a product someone wants is another question. But I think it's another one of those initiatives that we've done that has a lot of legs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really does have a lot of legs from one context to another to keep mapping these keywords and keep drawing out these situated practices and negotiations. And I think that building that does become a product if you can make it accessible to people with an interest in the result of that. I very much liked what Kevin was saying. I hadn't thought of it as a product-based output, if you like, but I think a think tank, as you were talking, Katherine, sits to somewhere between a knowledge, advancing knowledge, and developing a product that stakeholders could be interested in. So I guess the thing is continuing to look at other actors out there who would invest in the foundation of a think tank to push this kind of thinking forward and develop databases that are accessible to business, industry, NGOs, and policymakers alike. I mean, when I think about ACR, it seems to sit somewhere between the two things. They want products and they want to push knowledge forward. You know, they like to have advisory boards with experts and different things to ensure that you get dissemination of the knowledge. So the knowledge becomes a product as far as they want to know how you're going to disseminate it.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think we, you know, in a way, even putting the term product out there helps me. So let's not worry about it too much. But I know you weren't wanting it us to be totally caught up in the neoliberal sort of framing. And Kat, did you want to make a comment? I mean, you're kind of coming into it from not having been involved in the actual process, but I'm hoping some of it's making sense. A lot of it is.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I see Anne's got her hand up, but I'll.
Sorry, yeah. So I just saw that. Sorry, Anne.
Just, I think a couple of reflections in terms of just what we've got. So ACR, Kevin and Jenny might not know, ACR is the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, which is, it's a federal funding body that funds research, and Anne and I and Kath and Isaac are all currently connected with that funding source. It's one of these places where you build relationships and then somehow or other it all flows from there.
You know, so one of the reasons, can I just say, is that Jane Curnow, who did a PhD on the project, the action research in Indonesia and the Philippines, she did the Indonesian action research. She ended up becoming one of the program managers in that with the more social science and gender bent. She's left now, but that provided a bit of an opening for some of our work. So interesting. I mean, there's an interesting genealogy of networks. Yeah.
Yeah. So ACR is a place that is very receptive, I think, for the work that we're doing. And just thinking about, for example, the Melanesia toolkit that we produced. I mean, Kath, that has been used. It is being used, and my upcoming ACR projects, I've got two, one in Cambodia and one that's going to be working in Timor-Leste and the Solomons. The whole intention is to take that toolkit and apply it and adapt it and see how it goes in those contexts.
Great.
So,
Great.
So that's kind of already, that is happening.
Yeah, see, I didn't know that.
That's point to.
That's great.
Something we can point to as proof. And, you know, Isaac just mentioned a think tank. Yep, we've got that too. It's the CEI. Yeah, and I think for this, looking back over the proposal, I think that the heart of it, I can see how there's a stronger story to tell now than there was a few years ago in terms of how achievable it is, you know, as a safe bet for a funder. You know, have we got the actual frameworks upon which to do this big project? I think we can demonstrate that much better now than we could at that stage. The tricky thing is getting the narrative right and knowing how to tell the story effectively to the audience. So if it was ACR, it would be talking about a theory of change, which is basically, I think, the same thing as that kind of design futuring, where you're mapping your way back from what you want to achieve. It's demonstrating the utility of what you're producing, both as knowledge and as a thing, as a product or a website or whatever. You know, who's going to use it, how are they going to use it? Those stories are really important to be able to tell. And I think that thinking through those things is also can be really interesting, especially when you're trying to do it without somehow imposing a kind of blueprint approach, which was always the challenge with that proposal. You know, how do you come up with approaches without doing that? Oh, well, we'll know the answer and we'll just tell everyone how to do it, kind of thing.
So, Anne.
Thanks. I was going to pick up on what Isaac was saying about the Monsoon Asia project and language. And Jenny, you were talking about ABCD too, and one of the things that occurred to me when I was thinking about how work's moved on is that I've been working with Philippines-based colleagues in Mindanao who head up community organisations and ACR work, and a linguistic colleague. And what we've actually done is talked about how ABCD has been translated and adapted in use with Indigenous communities in Mindanao. And it's been very interesting to think about these examples of the work of the first community cooperative in Mindanao, FICOF, the Community Outreach Foundation, where my colleague Anselmo Mercado works. And that's been a very new direction in my work, where I've kind of been able to see how Indigenous and different communities in Mindanao have actually changed ABCD into different vernacular, into non-text-based kind of language, visual picture kind of language has been really key. So we've just got a book chapter on that under review at the moment. But I think that's a really interesting space to think about how language plays a role. And that's a big change from where I think we were 6 years ago. The other thing I want to say about ABCD is that I was involved in an ACR, or I ran an ACR pilot project, to seed funding project in Mindanao, where we used ABCD to do community food mapping. And as Katherine was saying, it was incredibly interactive. Like it was people learning through the process of doing the mapping, in much like earlier ABCD work that some of you have done. And I think that that's really key, that there's this sense of people being involved and having tools that allow people to do the sort of negotiation. And the last thing I would say is a huge change for me, I think, is based on a conversation with a PhD student that's starting next year with Katherine and I in UC, who really is quite passionate about working with Indigenous communities in Mindanao in the areas of across agricultural livelihoods, but her background is actually sociology and gender and sexuality research in the Philippines. And she keeps telling me about the precarious nature of people's lives and how their ethical negotiations are so like rich in terms of, you know, really understanding, I guess, what Kevin was saying, the sites of struggle. And I keep coming back to this sense of how do we kind of really tease out the social and emotional conditions of sustainability. Like this is something I'm becoming more and more interested in, instead of thinking that we're sort of creating these utopian kind of like a prototype as an ideal. It's actually the conditions along the way by which people negotiate. And I think Shang Puentes is really quite interested in that. And that comes from years of working for ACR, trying to develop tools and prototypes and products, and now feeling, you know, she developed this life model that's all based on ABCD, which ACR promotes now as a huge success, their life model. But behind it, she's dealing with people who are really grappling with their everyday existence in conflict vulnerable areas, in the face of marginalisation by the government, in the face of, you know, huge sort of ethical challenges, and making decisions, for example, to defy the lockdown, to go out to feed their family, you know, or living in a jeepney with 5 children, you know. And I think there's this concern I have that if we get so focused on products, we lose sight of the sense that, as you said, Katherine, this proposal was trying to challenge the neoliberal kind of agenda. So I'm still quite sort of, I guess, passionate about how we tease out the space of really grappling with the temporal rhythms in the face of climate change, as Katherine Gibson and I have been looking at in terms of how people live with flux, like how they actually do it and what sort of negotiations they make. And then also these other sites of vulnerability and kind of creating, what does surviving well look like for someone who's at the brink of existence in Mindanao, you know, and how do we develop prototypes that actually support that kind of future, that kind of livelihood. So anyway, so a few random thoughts, but.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Oh, good, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly, and what you were just saying really reminds me of Emma Power's recently funded discovery project, where she's talking about what she's calling shadow care infrastructures, and that allow people in places like Sydney that are really high rent regions to yeah, like actually make rent and survive under less than optimal conditions. So it's sort of it's a diverse economy strategy focused on surviving well in less than optimal conditions. And I suppose the ethic there is really, you know, how that's connected to material practice and how that's sort of operationalizing a kind of interdependence. And I suppose in a way, the Cooling the Commons project, it operates on that same premise, which is how do you produce cool as a distributed property in places where air conditioning isn't accessible and resources are limited? So what sorts of relationships between the natural and the built environment, shade and breeze, water, and so forth, can be enrolled in order to create a space that is bearable? That seems to be the threshold. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of a theory of change, but I don't know. Surviving well is a different sort of goal, I guess, than I think what funders find palatable, which is sort of they want a success story, and I don't know how to do justice to that.
If I can just add one thing, though, I think, you know, we in our Centre for Sustainable Communities, Katherine and I have been talking a lot with our Indigenous colleagues about Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing, and the tension that they have between their grassroots kind of modes of learning from country or learning with country and kind of being part of, you know, a university, a neoliberal education environment, and how you bring these ways of being together. And when Katherine and I met with ACR recently, the social systems manager was actually really inviting me, I guess, to rework a current concept note to marry Indigenous knowledge in Australia. So what we have in this funding proposal as our KPs, our knowledge partners, with Indigenous knowledge practices in the Philippines. And so, you know, if we're using the language of product, where we're really wanting to foster a hub environment where the rich place-based, you know, knowledge, experience and practice, the everyday negotiations, ethical negotiations of people across place can actually create an environment where people can experiment, they can reflect on their own practice. And so there's a clever way of coming up with a product that's actually about the richness of that peer-to-peer learning, you know, because ACR were definitely saying quite clearly to me, if you were to weave in a way of connecting that Indigenous practice in Australia and the Philippines, that would be really marketable for them, you know. So there's an opening to kind of think across the language of products and having to have something to pitch with the integrity of kind of people's Indigenous and place-based ways of knowing and being. And I think for me, if you focus on ways of knowing and being and doing, you're actually getting at the everyday negotiations that we call ethical negotiations in a community economy, you know.
Yeah.
How are people surviving? What are they actually doing, you know?
Yeah. And so, isn't in a sense what you've just described there what people mean by the term yarning?
Yarning.
Yeah. Yarning. Yeah. And in a way that is kind of the confluence of a language, a subject, and a form of collective action.
So have you finished, Stephen? Because I see Kevin's got his hand up.
Yeah.
Did you say? Yeah, okay. Kevin.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe I'm off base, but I'm just thinking about the range of initiatives, for lack of a better word, that serve as the basis for each prototyping across countries and cases and levels of economy and industrialization, on and on and on, right? Like and that's like one thing, you know, like, oh, this one's more about this than that, and this one is more about, you know, I don't know. I guess I'm just hesitant to describe sort of what it is that any one of those initiatives should focus on, or that we should foreground coming out of each one. And then I'm thinking, like, the proposal wasn't about that. The proposals was addressing the problematic, at least from my perspective, of scale or transposition, if you don't want to talk in terms of scale. You know, that was central to the entire thrust of the thing, is like, how can you amplify something, a whole range of things that we already know are happening all over the place. How can you amplify them and turn them into something big and transformative? Like, that seemed to me what we were trying to get funded. And that's, you know, so I guess I'm like, I got all kinds of thoughts about like that problematic, which is different than maybe the sort of axes that Anne and Stephen were just talking about. I'm not sure though. Anyway, I just want to throw that out there.
I'll just jump in there and then I'll turn to Isaac. But, you know, when you think about it, it was because it's, you know, there were imperative was to work with low income communities. You had to have so many from that particular category of country. So in a way, it still had a developmental agenda, because, you know, if we think about it, really where we need to do this work is in the minority world that's screwing up the situation for everybody else. But that wasn't where the transformations to sustainability had to occur. It had to come in the low income communities. So, you know, what we're saying is that so many of the low income communities have things we could be learning from, and that we want to sustain, not get rid of. And yet the whole thrust of that agenda was to work in those kinds of places. So, you know, that's one thing I think that we would want to, maybe they're not the people that we'd want to go to, but I guess that's why I'm interested in doing a bit of a content analysis of what did get funded and what they are doing, because I think it would be really helpful for us to kind of clarify what our agenda, our edge is, our edge, whatever is. And just the other thing I wanted to say is, I mean, it's incredible when you think of what has happened in terms of institutional successes. I mean, I'm just to think that Katherine and Anne are both working in a Centre for Sustainable Communities now is pretty amazing. I mean, all the people that were PhD students are now, you know, in positions teaching this work or doing projects like Isaac's doing, that is using this kind of work. And just Kelly's latest, you know, success, 5 years to do this work at a national level. It's pretty amazing, the success that we've had in terms of, so again, there's a sort of sense of a need to do what Jenny's saying, is like consolidate and just get more of a sense of all the things that we have developed that could inform the work that you're doing in your centre, or Kelly's going to be able to do, or whatever. So yes, there is that huge variety, Kevin, but there is something coherent there in terms of a stance, even though the way it's being practiced in different ways. But somehow getting a better handle on that for ourselves is also useful, I think. So I think it was Isaac next and then Stephen. Is that, yeah.
Thanks, Katherine. Yeah, I on Monday we discussed whether we were out of our depth with prototyping at that time. I think now, with the impetus of design, we're probably much more conversant with that language. But I still wonder if that's the right thing to be doing going forwards, or if that's the right way of framing what we're doing. It's just a provocation, really. I spoke of whether pattern thinking is another way to disseminate and try to, you know, extend from one context to another. So really, I'm commenting on what Kevin was just saying as well, which is the amplification. And so what I'm really provoking is, you know, how to do that.
The transposition issue.
Yeah, whether prototyping is the way to do it or whether it's something else.
Stephen.
So the way I understood the exchange that Anne and I were having was that idea of surviving well under difficult conditions, right? So there is a sense there that there's a kind of crisis that demands a kind of sustained relational and material response on the part of people. And then that can inform a larger conversation about transformation or transition. So I guess one thing that I was thinking about was the way in which the Redrawing Economy project really did carry forward what was outlined here in ANEP, and that the unifying thread across the three examples, Korea, Colombia, and Finland, wasn't simply that they were places where the Take Back the Economy had been translated, but also spaces that had conflict or crisis as the basis for formation of community economies. In Colombia, it was obvious it was 75 years of low intensity conflict. In Finland, it was sort of the end of growth economics. And in Korea, I think in light of the Squid Games, we're kind of getting the extent to which profound inequality and class conflict is really the context for a cooperative response. So I wonder if that's a thread that's worth carrying forward, is that in a sense, sort of this strategy around surviving well in a context of sort of where things are kind of coming apart at the seam is sort of the frame in which we're imagining what transition is. And to a certain extent, I suppose that's also a planetary condition. So that might be something that we could add to the narrative. But just to say something quickly about prototypes, I guess I'm thinking that like I was reading this book, Inventing the Social by Wilkes, Guggenheim, and Marys, and instead of language, subject, action, they have performativity, experimentation, matter, and techniques. And that really the list that you came up at the end of your presentation, Kath, in part was a whole set of techniques, new ways of measuring that actually constitute subjects or find new ways of representing, in this case, what would be surviving well. And I suppose the patterns and the pattern deck from the Cooling the Commons project would be another example of a technology of measurement and representation that produces a subject, which is a citizen in Sydney who's interested in being cooler. And how do you do that without relying on just air conditioning and whatever, just pure technical intervention?
I guess what Kevin's bringing up is how do these things that we invent or we co-create, where do they go? Like, Kat, it's great that you're going to use that gender metrics, for instance, in this new project, but it's not like we are, I don't know, kind of selling this as a method that lots of development agencies could be using. We're kind of, taking them off and using them in a sort of ad hoc way. I don't know. This is why I'm interested to think of how other groups do this with their products. If you look at the spin that's on something like the Post-Growth Institute of, our old friend Donnie, it's just amazing what is he putting out there? It's so vacuous. So I'm kind of interested for us to look back at these other big projects that have been funded to see what they actually come up with in terms of their product or whatever, and compare it to what we have, and then think through what would we need to do to, I don't know, get it transpositioned by different institutions or authorities or whatever. It does seem like that's a job, and I think we could spend some of our CEI money actually getting someone, if we had a postdoc or someone interested to do this work, actually paying them to do some of this, putting it our stuff together, but doing that kind of analytical work of what other people are doing that are doing these big projects that are trying to do transformations to sustainability, kind of sense where our contribution could be. Kevin, and then Kat. Unmute, Kevin.
Just noting that there's like our desire to produce things that spread, and then there's identifying how you're going to produce something that will spread in order to please a funder. Like, you know, and they may not necessarily be the same thing, although ideally they would be, right? Like, I don't know, I'm just kind of noting that, like, one of these is like the problematic of getting funded, and another is like, oh, what do we think we're doing as diverse economies scholars and activists or whatever. So that's one thing. And another, just really quick, like, I did write a proposal after this proposal that wasn't very good and didn't get funded, but if I had more time, it might have been better. My resolution, to some sense, or the thing that kind of helped me with some of the issues we're talking about was, you know, built into it. It was the same idea. It was like looking at different fishing initiatives that were progressive, sustainable, community kind of whatever, and trying to amplify them through some process. And in the case, the thing that was significantly different in the thing that I wrote versus the INEP one was that the sort of the equivalent, I guess, of the social lab in my proposal was a forum where one would invite a range of expertise, including that of the state, who's actually responsible for the resources that are in question that communities are engaging with, in this case, fisheries, and that the forum would include their expertise. Why would you want to do that? Because the sort of model, the prototype that might emerge from that process, you know, you want it to, or at least I did, I wanted it to be associated with the state. I wanted the state to see it and amplify it through all of their technologies, so I didn't have to reproduce that. You know, like by you know, the National Marine Fisheries Service in the United States actually recognizing community-supported fishing, and then turning it into like, well, is it sustainable? Is it not? How can we see it in other places? Should we fund it? Like letting them do that, or trying to facilitate, right? So that was the strategy that was a little different in my proposal, was to think really like, okay, if you read the INEP one, you know, there's this imaginary of somebody getting together and wanting it and doing stuff with it, but it isn't necessarily like the agency that's actually responsible for agricultural development in Uganda, you know, like this kind of thing, who has funding and impetus and whatever. So it's the association question that I talked about.
Well, it'd be great to see that proposal, Kevin. Perhaps put it into our bag of unfunded wonderful proposals for the research group.
Maybe it's unfunded for a reason. I get that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, a lot of it's what you're talking about, you know, the language we use, et cetera, et cetera. But Kat first, and then Isaac.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, Kevin, I think that, you know, the strategy of getting uptake, right, and spread, I think that's what's really interesting in this ACR work that we're doing. I feel like my whole reason for agreeing to come into these projects is precisely that. It's because ACR is a space where the state is funding research that can be done in the way I want to do it and produce what I want to produce. And because they're very, very closely connected with the Department of Foreign Affairs, who controls all the aid budget that Australia runs, and they work very closely with their in-country partners, there are, you know, it's the hope that there are conduits there through which the stuff will get taken up. So it's that kind of that intention. How to do that effectively is the thing I don't know how to do. And just reflecting on, you know, that that question of how do you do the spin, right? How do you share? How do you actually take that step of producing something that people, that speaks to people? I think there's aspects of what this group has done in the past that have achieved that, but it's a really hard thing to do. And I feel like we need to find somebody whose field it is to figure that out, you know, someone who is in comms or marketing and who has an interest in an engagement here. So I feel like I'd love it if the CEI could like have a research fellowship position or something that could be dedicated to that task of sort of thinking about the communication and that spread. And I'm on that note thinking that the conversation that Kerry facilitated between community economies and the kind of activist direct action groups, that kind of sparked some of that possibility. Maybe following up those lines is a possible strategy. But I agree with Anna's comment in the chat that perhaps this is part of when the CEI board is thinking about strategic planning, which is coming up in the next couple of months, that this question maybe is part of what the Institute should be thinking about. Unfortunately, we don't have funding, of course, to fund like a whole somebody's salary or anything quite to that extent. But
no, but we have Kelly working. She can be our person.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, Kelly, now you think you're being employed by the Rutherford Fellowship, but really, you're really got a work agenda from the CEI. Okay, I think it was it Isaac next and then Stephen?
This is a very short point, but one of the things that went down well with ACR from our project, the digital finance and farming, is that we're going to work with an organization called Techo Startup Center, who are part of a $65 million project in Cambodia to digitize the agricultural value chain. And they are partnering with us to synthesize our research output into what's going to be called the Khmer Agriculture Suite, KAS, which will be a digital platform synthesizing interoperable data from all kinds of systems for the benefits of policy, industry, in both farming and digital finance. So I guess my point is that I think it would be good for CEI to look to other institutions, not to say that they should get a share of funding for things that we do, but to look to other institutions that are definite stakeholders in our work that would want to house our research and help to disseminate the tools and products of our work into other spheres. I think that would be a strategic thing that CEI should be doing, is looking to other institutions that can become formal partners, without saying that they should take big shares of any grant funding, but just I think it's a way to attract grant funding. If you want to demonstrate you've got a product that will carry and will be used widely, I think it would be good for us to identify partners in that respect.
It's an interesting idea, kind of the idea of inviting some partners to kind of identify with what we are doing, not asking them for anything apart from that kind of moral support at this point. I don't know. We haven't thought of that, like where we would like to see, not sponsorship so much, but connections. Anyway, thanks for that, Stephen, for that, Isaac. So Stephen.
I guess that strategy of affiliation or fellow travelers is what Donnie is doing in the Post-Growth Institute, and it makes him look good, right? Like that he's got a natural constituency for any sort of research outputs that he has. And when I think about the manufacturing projects, or the one on waste now, or the commons linkage, in each of them we've sort of developed advisory boards, and that kind of speaks to that question that Kevin's identified here of who's your constituency. So that's kind of inbuilt into how that kind of grant seems to work. But it's a totally different matter to be, that's just something you do to make it look good to get funded. It seems to me that the CEI, if they were to do that exercise and to think about where and who would want to uptake this work, that's the kind of conversation that we should have in the context of a symposium or something where we're really getting as many people together as possible. So that might be a practice that we've developed that can really be leveraged to push this kind of thing forward.
You done?
But yes.
And I think, and then Kat, and yeah, hoping everyone's okay to keep going until 10, like to make it a full 2-hour discussion. Is that okay? Yeah, okay, great. Anne?
Yeah, thanks. I was thinking, okay, I'm just trying to remember, I think it was you, Katherine Gibson, saying, I'm just starting to lose the threads because what I'm thinking about is coming back to various things you've said earlier. So I guess just one thing is Kevin's comment about having organisations like the NSF be able to do the work of amplifying. And so coming or accelerating or whatever, taking a tool or taking a product and then disseminating it. So it got me thinking about the role that the CEI and this kind of proposal plays in being the conduit that sits between the grassroots, the communities, the places where the kinds of knowledge and practice that I'm thinking about, Indigenous place-based practices sit. So all the work that we've done in the space of community partnering, action research, all those tools and methods kind of put us in a position where we are well placed to do that work of listening to communities, deeply engaging with what they're doing. And I think it was your point, Katherine, about the way this was designed, KG, the way this was designed to be sort of in countries that were in the majority world, and we had to have a certain number of countries. And you described it a little bit as a problematic, but I actually thought of it more as an opportunity to say, look at all the knowledge and the practice that's going on in these places that's not highly visible, and a lot of our Monsoon Asia work has been about making visible knowledge that's been rendered, absent and silenced. And so it seems like we have a really key role to play in being a conduit that would actually say it's great to be working in Latin America and Asia and all the different places that we might choose, and to work with communities who struggled to have their voice heard, to have their knowledge and their practices recognised. And Isaac and I are grappling with trying to pull the resilience entry of the CEI or collective authorship together for this development encyclopedia, aren't we, Isaac? And we've been working with a group of authors, and two of them are Alison Guzman and Ignacio. I'm sorry, Ignacio, I can't remember your surname at the moment, who are talking about Mapuche resilience and how the lived experience is changing the way we might think about terminology. So Stephen, your comment in the chat space made me think about the fact that they're just saying, in a way, resilience is a term that's been a very colonial term. And so they're reconfiguring what resilience looks like in the context of the communities they've worked with. And the way they're writing about counteracting racism and trauma and rethinking, resilience in the context of Mapuche communities they work with is really powerful. So I think it just cements for me that sense that we could actually be a conduit that helps to bring to visibility the kind of ethical negotiations and so on in these places that have been kind of undermined or marginalised. And there's already so much work we do in that space. But it would be then, what would the product be? And would the product be some kind of reframing educational kind of process, or revaluing that actually is something that organisations like ACR do want to know about. So it's just a matter of how it gets packaged.
So I think we've got another 25 minutes. The various people need to leave at 10 to the hour. So and Jenny's suggesting, I'm going to go to Kat next, but Jen's suggesting we then maybe turn to thinking about next steps that come out of this this discussion, because there's been so many rich ideas, and I think it would be good just to even make a list for ourselves. So Kat.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should probably draw a line under the discussion and go to next steps pretty soon. I just wanted to mention something that we haven't actually discussed, but I think is going to be really important, and that is thinking about language. So we've kind of had these occasional conversations coming up about this term, community economies. And Kath, you've mentioned a few times in the last few months about, you know, is this a term that really speaks to people? Should we be thinking about a different name, a different language for what it is we're doing? And I think if we're going to revisit this proposal and think about a new iteration of it, it might be a moment to be trying to pin down what that language might be. I feel like there's lots of different ways we could go, and terms that are useful in my own work at the moment. I found what people assume I mean when I talk about community economies takes it in a direction that's not very helpful. So I've started talking about livelihood ecologies instead, which seems to help. Anyway, I think it's a big discussion, but one that we probably need to have around these issues of how do we talk about what we do, how do we package up what we're going to offer, how do we connect people, and how do we tell the story of the community economies work.
Yeah, that's really great to bring that back up again. I mean, just interestingly, I was involved in the discussion last night with about 20 or 30 people that are part of this EU-funded project around trying to develop a social economy masters in Europe. And so it has, it's really coming out of the Greeks. Yorgos and Karavelis got involved, but so at that meeting, like Fred Freundlich was there from the Mondragon University, a whole lot of people, Valerie Fournier, who's a social economy person, but from the CERN network or from CEI, Pete North was there, myself, Ezra, and maybe someone else. But it was interesting because they talked about having done a big survey of what people would like or what's already been done around this kind of issue in the programs that they've in Europe in 4 or 5 different countries. And, you know, they were kind of oscillating around the fact that some countries talk about more cooperatives and others social enterprises. And I kind of proposed, because I'm on the scientific advisory committee, I said, what about the kind of non-institutionalized forms of solidarity and social economy? And the next thing you know, Pete North's coming in saying, yes, we need a community economies perspective. I was thinking it was so interesting because for so long he's kind of resisted that, but he was really just referring to all the sort of stuff we do and using the language. It's not an argument for keeping it necessarily, but it was just interesting that we were kind of, and I think a lot of people were agreeing with that need to broaden out and diversify away from purely institutionalized forms of social economy, and the need for what would the educational or the master's program that do that look like, and so on. Anyway, but that's another kind of one of those big networks that we have a sort of role in, and where I guess, there's some influence on what that a master's program that might come out of all this might look like. Oh, great, thanks. I'll have to make sure I can save this chat afterwards. But I guess the thing is to think about some next steps, and maybe we need to kind of just make a list and see what comes out. Maybe everyone could mention one thing that stood out for them, and then we go around a few times to just make a kind of not big discussion, but maybe just a list. And I guess the first thing on my list is that reconsidering the naming of community economies that Katherine's brought up, and that needs a big discussion. But I mean, obviously, Ethan's already, made a case for that too, ecological livelihoods. And what would be the implications of doing that? I guess is another thing. So, my first one thought I had during this discussion, in terms of a next step, and it's not necessarily a next step, it's more of a thought. Is there room for a Take Back the Economy style book that documents a lot of these devices, a lot of these technologies that we've come up with somehow? I don't know. That's just a thought. Something that's very much a easy to use, popular, you know, we did put some of these things in there, but we didn't kind of, and there is about how to use them, but maybe there's a more elaborated way of talking about them and what they could do. Just a thought. Who'd like to go next about some next steps? Yeah, Jen.
So, yeah, partly because I've just been doing some work on the website, and we've got a section of the website called Research Projects, and basically people just, you know, in a very ad hoc way put up their research project, you know, and in a fairly standard sort of format. But, you know, it seems to me that one thing we could do is actually think about how we might classify, you know, people, and again, this would be getting to know each other's work more, how we might classify people's research projects in terms of things like axes such as surviving well. But, you know, what are ways that we could represent and communicate the sort of research work we do outside of just, you know, here's research project 1, research project 2, but thinking about axes that we might use to communicate some of what it is that, you know, community economies work does.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that could fit with employing somebody to do that kind of inventory of our own work, first of all, and also things that are getting funded. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Next, anybody want to take a stab at another next step? Kevin, got any?
Not sure. So is it next steps? Let's see here. Is it next steps in terms of like thinking about a funder and a proposal, or is it next steps for us as, you know, what do we do with this as our own trajectory?
I think probably the latter.
I don't know.
First.
I don't have anything for either of those, by the way.
Okay.
I mean, I have ideas how I would rewrite this proposal. Like that's what I kind of thought about when I was preparing for this meeting. And I didn't really think of it as rethinking us, kind of. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's anything at the moment. It's sort of a brainstorm next step. It's not a really, you don't have to commit to anything at this point. It's just any ideas that have come up that could come out of this discussion. So one is rewrite the whole proposal. But I think, I mean, to me, what some of the things you mentioned were what might be a wider group of specialists that are outside of our field that we start to identify that we might want to bring into anything like a proposal like this. Because I mean, one of the things about it is it was so in-house in a way, like, and I guess, you know, to what extent working with other kinds of scientists or other kinds of practitioners as part of a research agenda might be something we think about. I mean, definitely there's a lot of funding going on for that intersection of physical sciences, social sciences, but we don't have a lot of relationships with physical scientists, really. I mean, you probably do more than, and maybe Zara does, but a lot of the rest of us don't. So I'm just wondering whether trying to make those connections more could be something too. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that depends on, you know, the project you're going for. And,
yeah,
you know, and I mean, it's not just that. I mean, it is also too about the degree to which we, in some sense, do want to talk about the socio-natural and as, you know, as the ontological ground for community economies. It's like, well, then, yeah, that requires a range of expertise that, you know, can be resident and wild, but can also be, you know, formalized by all kinds of smart scientists.
Yeah, I think it's, and then part of that, doing the work that Jenny just talked about, you know, like classifying our proposals might be partly thinking about what kind of other expertise relates to those topics, like the surviving well one. Obviously, there's a whole range of like medical scientists that Katherine, I mean, it turns out, I don't know if she's gone away now, but she just said her whole visualization, Kat, you were talking about how your visualization of birth is now being picked up and wanting to be used by obstetricians, so, or others, nursing. I mean, each of our areas that we're working in, we have identified kind of other expertise in sciences or medical or nutrition or architecture that kind of relate to what we're doing, and getting a sense of who they are, who might be those voices around the different kinds of work we do. In manufacturing, we could easily think of people too, you know. So that's part of that kind of networking, making more visible who those people could be, I think, in different areas.
I'm glad you just mentioned that list, because I think when you said that we don't do a lot of work with scientists, I thought actually if you really looked deeply at that, there's so many within our CERN network, our CEI network, who do food research, who link with agricultural scientists and nutritionists and all sorts of science-based people. And then there's all those other examples you just mentioned. So I think we'd probably find that many of us are the social science voice in big interdisciplinary projects that span lots of disciplines. So I think that would be a common thread.
Yeah, so it's how do you get a handle on all this? It's like, I feel like it's some sort of big mud map or something that needs to happen here. It's just so hard to, because you're right, as soon as I mentioned, I just thought, look at all the work you've done with Robert Holmer and all those people, it's just amazing. So I don't know, just keeping it all in your head's the hard thing.
Well, I think Isaac's thing of the pattern.
Yeah.
I just think the pattern, like in my head, the map is, as I said, we're kind of like a conduit that sits in the middle between the communities we work with and the funders and larger organisations that have traction in terms of wanting products or wanting prototypes that they can replicate. I mean, if I think of the limited conversations I've had with ACR, they want models that they can replicate. They want something that they can roll out. So if we can develop something that can be rolled out that actually comes from the grassroots and that has integrity for people at the grassroots, what a powerful thing to be able to do.
Yeah, great. Rolled out, I like that. Well,
that's how they describe it.
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking of my flag that Oscar Spade had, of the UNDP flag, and it's got the tractor rolling out over the verdant paddy fields, So that was from the talk I had to do in the ICS last week. Kevin, Stephen or Isaac, have you got any thoughts about next step stuff? Stephen first.
Yeah, sure. So I felt like one thing that came up was to revisit some of the key terms from this proposal, and that could make a great topic for a symposium. So the two that came up were, is prototype the right word? And what do we mean by that? And then the second one was ethics, which I think both I and Kevin mentioned, and wondering, is there a way of kind of getting at ethical outcomes without naming things as ethics in advance? And then there's bigger terms that get called into question. So resilience is one that has a lot of traction with funders. Is there another term that we could use that wouldn't have such a kind of neoliberal individualist impulse behind it? And then there was the bigger question of community economies. And I don't know what to do there, but I do feel like we have a fora for thinking through these things with a larger group. And that would be both intellectually interesting and would be a way of advancing this idea of a bigger collaborative project. In terms of like impact, or like developing a constituency, which is what I heard Kevin saying, and thinking about impacts. I know like the way that the Young and Resilient Research Center does that is that they bring in experts to talk about that regularly, people who are professionals. And, we could do the same thing with comms. In terms of reaching the medical science community, I think Declan Cooch would be another person that we have in our network who's done a lot of work thinking about precision medicine as potentially a commons. So using diverse economies language in his work. has done the same thing with energy. And then lastly, I do like that idea of a book about tools. And I just think that perhaps the Next System Projects piece is a kind of a resource there, a potential draft, but that was done for somebody else's book.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it could be written in a kind of platformy sort of way. Even if it was published open source or published by CEI, it might be useful.
Is that what is a platformy way? Is that like
well, like where we would just give people a kind of a template for like how do you describe the tool, which is kind of how that Next Systems Project piece got written, was that there was a set of parameters and then people describe it. So that would give it a kind of uniformity, but that in a way it would, if the objective would be, here's how we've used this concept of commenting and patterns, then that's what we could then communicate more broadly, and people could do the same thing with surviving well as a concept. Or I know Alison and Ignacio have been using that term survivance as another description of it, but it's a way of describing kind of in local place-based indigenous economies.
Isaac, did you have anything to add to the?
Not really. As next steps go, I agree with Katherine. Get someone good at marketing to come in and have a look at things from a marketing perspective, and give some feedback on how the institute is positioning itself within the marketplace for funding from different sources, I guess. And I just think bringing that way of thinking. I'm saying that because a very close friend of mine, Nicholas, he was a marketing professor from La Trobe, and he does a lot of work in social enterprise and things as well. And the way he talks about marketing is very complex and very sophisticated, and it just strikes me that someone with that kind of expertise would be a huge asset.
I mean, it occurs to me that having some workshops where we invite people in and have a discussion with them before we go ahead and
I could ask him to run a workshop for us.
Yeah, right. Just we have a kind of masterclass with him about what sort of thing would he have to offer, but also the idea of bringing different medicos from different contexts together to have a discussion around what we do, or a few agronomists, like to have some targeted workshops where we actually set up a conversation with some of these other. I'm
imagining his focus would not be so much about, using money for it, but how you allocate the resources you've got most optimally to a marketing mission.
Yeah. And, the thing about getting a big grant is a bit scary to me, because who would actually do it, I mean, there is the certain thing about what is our capacity at this stage. What sort of growth do we want to participate in? And yeah, back in the 2014, we just thought this was the way to go. We wanted a big collaborative grant, and I'm not sure, but what is our highest priority now? So Stephen and then Kevin, and then we should probably wrap up. Stephen.
I mean, just really quickly, I just think that concept that Ned Rossiter and Brett Nielsen developed of platform research might be a way of thinking about developing an international version of this INEP program, but where there's a discrete set of tasks that can be done remotely by different researchers in our network. And then if we draw on a network of almost 300 people, we might find people in different places who could explore, what does surviving well mean in this context? So that would be a way of, I guess, redistributing the work and controlling the direction, and coming up with an output that could then inform something like that book that you were just describing. So that would be a way of making it manageable and leveraging an asset that we have, which is this big network.
So they would come up with like stories or analytical kind of.
Yeah, or videos, or diagrams. There
Yeah.
could be visual communicative outputs that we would specify, and that way it would still be a CEI product, but in a way it would invite other people in, which is the way that you deal with not having capacity.
Yeah. Great. Kevin.
Yeah, I just, I'm listening to all these great ideas, and especially around like the recognition of networks and like enrolling and communicate. And I'm just like, well, to what end? And I'm thinking about the projects that I've been involved in and the way that they evolve, given the target, so yeah, we are connected, and we're connected to all kinds of people, and the target would be the X Foundation's upcoming whatever in 9 months. And then you do all this legwork to build the network that produces the proposal that's perfect for that target. I don't know why I would be doing it without that kind of target. And the target doesn't have to be a funded project. The target could be like, I don't know, something to do with our own foundation and what we want it to be, but still that it seems to me that's pretty essential, because I think one of the things that's different than 6 years ago for me is like we are much more networked, and we can draw on a lot more resources, or rather intentions to do things from a whole bunch of people, but like 6 years ago, we need money to do it, because we can't run on all this volunteer labor forever. It just keeps, great ideas gel and then they dissipate because there isn't the funded institution or the funded whatever, even if it's a 5-year thing or whatever, it produces, I don't know. That's just my experience, is that the target, that these projects and the people I've been worked on, the other co-PIs and the development of it, and who are we going to get to do this? Who are we going to get to that? We should add this thing, and we should, that's like easily a 6 to 10 month process with a known target at the other end, which is the NSF X program, to which we're going to get $5 million from.
Yeah, I mean, what we were advised by Bradley and Rob was that we should be going for funding for just the core work of the Institute, which could involve some of this kind of work. And that's where we started 2 years ago now, Stephen, wasn't it? With our little kind of...
No, it hasn't been 2 years, because it came out at the last AGM.
Oh yeah, well, a year ago then. I know I'm getting very confused with COVID years. So we came up with a pitch and we kind of left it for a bit. And I guess this is another iteration of thinking about how to, potentially whether to return to that pitch mode and trying to set up those meetings or what. And I guess that's something we'll return to with the strategic planning when we do it in the board coming up, because now it's time for everyone to, Dave's got me a tea.
There's a way in which this conversation was really a demonstration of how we've realized a lot of the aims of the UNIP projects over the last 6 years, not as a single venture, but as a whole suite of them. And probably telling that story would be good no matter what the purpose is.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I take the point, Kevin, about needing, once you have a target, then you can work backwards. But I don't think we haven't got the capacity for that to some extent yet. And partly the idea was to go for a funding to get to be able to have a full-time member, for instance, associated with the Institute, that would be able to help orchestrate this kind of thing. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing going on here a little bit for me. Where do we put our efforts? And potentially, I mean, next year I'll be in a different situation. Maybe there's an opportunity I'll have to have some of those meetings, like the kinds of things that Rob set up for us with one of the foundations. And I think all this kind of just becoming more familiar with what we have is part of being able to be more forceful in those discussions. So let's have Kat as the last comment, and then we probably should wrap up. And I just want to thank everybody for the time put into this, but it's kind of, this is what we need to be doing a bit more of, I guess, to try and just learn more about what we do and what our strengths are. Yeah. Kat.
It just occurs to me that one of the really key points that I gathered from those conversations about how to access philanthropic funding was that, you know, philanthropic funders, unlike grant funders, they want to know what you need, what you want to do that you can't do and you need their help with. So, you know, I think a lot of what we're talking about is exactly that. And if we can, you know, move those kinds of conversations forward, this is one strand to follow, is how do we articulate this to a philanthropic funder who's like, wow, you guys are doing great stuff. And we're like, yes, we are, but this is what we really need to do and want to do. And can you help us get there?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think we've got a better handle on what it is we do and what we've been able to achieve in 6 years. As Stephen said, there's a great narrative there. Okay, so I just need some help with technical people. Thanks, Kevin. How do I save, or who does the host
Chat
save?
is already saved. It's already saved.
Where does it get saved to?
Just well, the recording saves the chat and the audio and the video. So we get 3 files that we can then access.
I didn't realize this chat would get saved. That's good, because there's a lot of juice in there.
Yeah. And then we need the time to look at it again. But I mean, it's something that we could revisit in some of the strategic planning meetings, perhaps, or at least some sort of function or some research group can. I think we have to recruit Kelly onto the research group immediately.
Yes.
In fact, she can take over. Okay.
I have one point to add before we wrap up, really, for Katherine and Stephen. So I do still have a day of work outstanding for the Community Economies Institute. So that was the reason why I've sat in on, well, it wasn't the only reason, but it was one of the reasons why I sat in on these 2 sessions, was to try and think how I can use that day productively. So perhaps we can reconvene for a discussion.
Well, you know, one thing that immediately comes to mind is I'd love you to look at the 12 projects that got funded through this second round of the transformation to sustainability, and just maybe do a table of some kind that kind of summarizes kind of what they're doing, what their output will be, or something. I mean, at least do as much as you can within one day. But I think just getting a sense of what got funded would be really great. And I haven't had a chance. I started looking at it, and I went into this rabbit hole, and I thought, oh, I've got to pull back in order to get prepared for this discussion. But I think that could be really interesting. And it's maybe we just need a very thin-boned who it is, kind of what they said, what they're wanting to do, what their product is, just for the 12 projects would be kind of interesting, I think. That's something that I can come up, I think would be an immediate help.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Great. Oh, well, thanks, everybody. Great to see you all, and thanks for a great discussion.
Thanks, everyone. Look
I'm
after
heading up to
yourselves.
Newcastle, so I'm going to run the last session tonight, the film from Newcastle. So
wow, I hope that goes well.
Safe.
First time out of Sydney. For about
How
a year.
exciting.
I'll come past you, Stephen. You'll be waving and
give me a wave. See you all.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
See ya.
See you all. Bye. Bye.